The United States and China are in a tick-for-tock technology war, where the race to advance with AI is underway. How a high-profile Palantir executive and former Google policymaker is playing his part.
We need to make sure that we win the AI race and that we have the very best capabilities in AI in the world. I think it's so important because I think the narrower the gap gets in our technological capabilities and China's, the less deterred China might be, and the higher the risk of political instability and potentially armed conflict.
From get ready with me to get ready to divest, US politicians and intelligence officials believe TikTok is something more sinister than singing and dancing, a serious national security threat and example of China espionage. A 4-year-long battle between the global superpowers has culminated in a US divest or ban order against TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance. It's set to protect the 170 million Americans who use TikTok, but it's also geopolitical, all part of an escalating argument between the East and West. TikTok has strongly denied allegations it's controlled by the Chinese government and has filed a petition in a federal court saying the bill is obviously unconstitutional.
Rest assured, we aren't going anywhere. We are confident and we will keep fighting for your rights in the courts. The facts and the Constitution are on our side, and we expect to prevail again.
But other tech leaders still demanded action, in a rare move where Silicon Valley took to Capitol Hill. Jacob Helberg was behind it, the advisor to Palantir's CEO, ex-Google policymaker, and commissioner of the US-China Economic and Security Review created by Congress. In this interview, he explains the threat TikTok posed in this techno-economic war and what is likely to come next. Jacob, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about this. I'm so excited to have a conversation with you.
I'm incredibly excited to be on. Thank you for having me.
Previously called this, quote, nothing short of a tech war evolving in real time. Can you start by giving me a high-level update on where the US and China are at now? And how does this TikTok divestiture bill affect that standing?
Yeah, so if I could just back up a little bit and provide a little bit of geopolitical tech history. So part of what we saw was in the early 2010s during the Arab Spring, there was this notion in the West that the internet was inherently a liberalizing force, that it would ultimately lead to decentralized, leaderless movements that would allow and empower people to organize and assemble and ultimately rebel against authoritarian oppressive regimes, as happened in Egypt. Part of what we saw was the reaction in Beijing, Tehran, and Moscow was to race in order to turn the internet on its head and use it as a tool to centralize control and assert state authority over their population. So in the wee hours of the Arab Spring, China basically kicked out Google, Facebook, and the like. It erected the Great Firewall. It started putting in place a lot of restricted censors. It built a vast 2 million person propaganda apparatus inside of China. Tehran and Russia did smaller scale variations of similar things where they started using the internet in order to track dissidents, do nighttime arrests, and so forth. And part of what we're seeing now is really a bifurcation in the global internet. This obviously started when China erected the Great Firewall and effectively broke the internet in half. But now we're just, as China erased the dividing line between its public and private sector, it basically declared that all of its companies, including its technology companies, were tools of the Chinese state, which ultimately means that if you are a democracy in an open system, you have to decide if you want to allow Chinese companies in your country, which are vehicles for China's political objectives, or if you're going to put in place restrictions. And part of what we're seeing happen with the TikTok debate is that democracies, I think, are more and more landing being led to the conclusion that there are national security risks to allow a major content platform and data collection platform to be in the hands of a foreign government are simply too high. And so we're just seeing this natural bifurcation between the authoritarian internet and the free internet.
I do want to discuss that exact point and how this plays out politically. But just on your national security point, I know that you're privy to more classified intel, but there is obviously still a lot out there in the public domain. Could you just define the threat for me? What are the actual risks that TikTok poses to America's democracy and national security?
Yeah, so there's really two basic risks. First of all, when we talk about the TikTok debate and whether or not it should be banned, I just want to note that China has banned all of our platforms in China, so that's not a national security risk. It's a trade issue, which I think it's only fair to raise because obviously our amazing technology builders in Silicon Valley have a lot of bones to pick about the fact that they're not allowed in the world's largest internet market. So that's number one, the trade reciprocity issue. On the national security piece, there's the surveillance risk, which the Chinese government has, and TikTok, frankly, has demonstrated a clear pattern of Chinese state-sponsored surveillance. And the second is the state propaganda piece, which whereby the Chinese government uses TikTok in order to push pro-CCP narratives to foreign audiences, which often focus around discrediting democracy, discrediting elected officials, democratic institutions, as well as turning democratic allies against themselves. So the U.S. against Israel, the U.S. against Australia, NATO, et cetera. With a common refrain that we often hear, and I'm sure you guys have heard this too in New Zealand, is TikTok has invested a lot of time in this narrative that the risk is hypothetical, that there's no evidence, behind this national security risk. That's not true. That might have been true, 2 years ago. But today we actually know that it's not a hypothetical risk, that enough information has made its way into the public domain that actually substantiates a lot of the risk that people are concerned about.
Could you give me an example? Sorry to interrupt you there, Jacob, but could you give me an example of how TikTok does that? Do they have bots that are commenting inflammatory things, or are they creating their own content? Or is it rather the way the algorithm works with what it is and isn't recommending?
Yeah, I would love to give you examples. So first of all, China has laws. They have the national security law, which requires citizens and organizations to support the work of national security government bodies. They have the national intelligence law of 2017, which also requires any organization or citizen to support, assist, and cooperate with state intelligence work. They have the national cybersecurity law and the data security law, which all amount to basically saying tech companies have to do whatever we want, is the basic gist. Now, let's look at the evidence of what TikTok's statements relative to what we know has actually become public. The TikTok CEO said before the US Congress under oath in March of last year that American user data, that first of all, TikTok was an independent company. It was not under the control of the CCP, and that American user data was stored on American soil in American servers run by American citizens. How do we know that's not true? We know that's not true because in 2022, audio tapes obtained by BuzzFeed contained 14 statements from 9 different TikTok employees, indicating that engineers in China had routine access to US user data. That same year, a different investigation by Forbes also found that Beijing-based employees at ByteDance used TikTok data to discern the location of US citizens. The following year, in May of 2023, another Forbes investigation showed that US user data on TikTok had in fact been stored in China, including the financial and social security information of US-based creators. Finally, this year, right before the TikTok divestiture bill passed, 11 former employees interviewed by Fortune said that they were forced by a secret dotted line managers based in Beijing to transfer US user data, and that nearly every 14 days, as part of their jobs, they had to email spreadsheets filled with data for hundreds of thousands of US users over to ByteDance workers in Beijing, which included names, email addresses, IP addresses, geographic location, and the like.
If we look at the US social media platforms, though, they're not perfect either. If you can remember the Facebook Cambridge Analytica privacy scandal, for example. And there are suggestions of foreign interference through US platforms in the likes of elections. So you're effectively saying that the threat posed by TikTok is different purely because of its ownership structure.
So you're exactly right. And I'm 100% in favor of a data privacy law that addresses the issues around data brokers and the way that user data in the US in general is handled. There are really serious, legitimate issues around content moderation and federal privacy. The point that I've made to policymakers is at the end of the day, our domestic companies or companies based in the West writ large, where you do have a separation between the private and the public sector, that is ultimately a different qualitative type of issue. That's a federal privacy issue that's different than the national security risk when the company is an instrument of a foreign government.
China, though, seems to be leaning on this economic argument, which you say trade kind of isn't the whole issue here. The US sees this, as you say, as much more about security. So how much of this is actually about economics and how much of it is about national security?
Well, I think the economic argument, the trade argument shouldn't be underestimated. And in my view, it's totally legitimate. With that being said, I think the motivating, galvanizing force behind the passage of the TikTok divestiture bill was fundamentally the national security argument. But in terms of whether it's an economic or a national security issue, from the US, on the US side, the motivating force was 100% the national security concern. On the Chinese side, I think where it's going to be a very revealing moment when the clock runs out on the divestiture window, and we will know if the Chinese government was in it for the money, they're going to allow an orderly divestiture and collect the proceeds from that divestiture. If they're in it for the influence, they will prefer a ban. And so, ultimately, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we'll all see this play out.
Well, this is actually what I wanted to ask you about. What happens next? What is the mechanics of the bill? Do they have a sort of grace period before they're forced to sell? What happens?
Yeah, so from what I remember, they have about 21 months in total to allow for a divestiture, so just a little bit under 2 years. I believe it's 12 months initially. There's a 12 months window initially, and then the president has the authority to grant an additional 9 months of essentially a grace period. So that would be a total of maximum up to 21 months statutorily. They have 21 months to divest, and if the clock runs out on those 21 months, they will get banned. And TikTok is named in the bill, so there's no avoiding it. They are totally in scope.
We should note that TikTok is vehemently denying any wrongdoing here. So what happens if they fight it through the courts like TikTok says they will? Does that clock keep running?
So the interesting, I think it's going to get quickly dismissed in the courts because, first of all, we don't know if they're going to successfully get an injunction. But I think the courts will quickly dismiss it because the case that they filed in the courts actually includes an admission. First of all, they simply repeated the same arguments that they tried making to Congress, which were totally unpersuasive. And then they also included an admission that the Chinese government is going to veto the sale and that they're effectively controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So I am actually kind of shocked, to be honest, at how poorly constructed their argument is. I don't know what law firm they used, and if our great legal industry is charging them a lot of money for legal advice that frankly is a little bit subpar. But it's going to be entertaining to see this play out.
Well, millions of Americans, I believe 170 million, still use TikTok. So it certainly holds a lot of value, which I imagine some firms in the US will be looking at wanting to purchase.
It's a great business. It's a very profitable business. I think if they allow a divestiture, a lot of people would be very interested in buying it. I mean, by all accounts, people say that the algorithm is incredibly potent. It's super entertaining and engaging. So if they allow a divestiture, I'm sure there's a variety of different buyers who would be interested in buying it.
So who should buy it, in your view?
Well, an interesting thing is under a Democratic administration, first of all, under this administration, the Biden administration, there have been very few mergers in tech in general because the regulatory agencies have taken a very hawkish stance on the antitrust issue. And so they haven't allowed a lot of mergers. That will be especially true in a TikTok divestiture scenario where Meta, Google, none of these companies will be allowed to buy it. On the conservative side, if a Republican wins the White House, I suspect the antitrust issue won't really be that big of an issue, and there won't be an aversion to mergers, but Meta will still not be allowed to buy it because, quite frankly, conservatives don't believe that Meta needs to further consolidate its market on as a social platform. So, Steve Mnuchin is putting together a conglomerate allegedly to pursue an acquisition of TikTok. Mr. McCourt is also putting together a conglomerate. The owner of the LA Dodgers is putting together a conglomerate to try to pursue a purchase. Back in 2020, Oracle and Walmart were interested in pursuing a purchase. So there's a lot of really interesting, eclectic potential buyers out there, but it's a great business. It's super profitable. I'm sure there will be buyers if a divestiture is given a chance.
As someone who used to work in finance and investment banking, I have no doubt this will be like the M&A talk of the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jacob, if we can get into the geopolitics of this a bit more, and this is really the core issue that I wanted to touch with you on. You mentioned companies like Meta, who may benefit if they get to buy it, or at least if ad spend sort of falls into their hands more post-TikTok sale. But how could China retaliate here? Obviously, they can't retaliate on US tech companies because, as you mentioned, with the firewall, they're not even allowed to operate there at the moment. But what are other US companies that are at risk of being used as leverage here?
Well, China's biggest source of leverage over the US in general is always supply chains. So if they do something against there's really actually two sources of leverage. Our hardware companies are very exposed. So Tesla, Apple, predominantly. Secondarily, a variety of other American hardware companies are allowed to do business in China. China views hardware as a strategic priority for its development. So it's allowed American hardware companies like Tesla, Apple, Qualcomm, and the like to sell their goods in China under the condition that their goods were manufactured in China through joint ventures. So they could either retaliate by putting, quotas or whatever it is, going after the market share of these American companies in China, or they could start using their control over American supply chains to start to strangle some of our companies, which has been a risk. We have known this was, one of the big risks of American companies making things in China for some time. It's a major issue. And ultimately, it's one of the big reasons why I have been a huge proponent of indiscriminate tariffs on Chinese hardware in order to create a very strong incentive for these companies to start leaving China once and for all. But ultimately, that's their main leverage. The universe of options that they have at their disposal is quite limited.
But these supply chains in China with chips and, with Tesla and Apple and their hardware, this runs so deep. Is it impossible to unscramble that egg now?
I think it's not impossible. I mean, the iMac was made in Elk Grove, California, as recently as 2000. So it's really been, China's emergence as the world's factory floor has really been in the last 20 years. It's not ancient history. And you're 100% right that they have developed an ecosystem that is so holistic and so impressive, frankly. It really should, it's formidable, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of that ecosystem. With that being said, I think our private sector, and when I say our, I mean the Western, writ large private sector, is actually really good at problem solving if you just give them simple rules. One of the things that I learned working in tech is simple rules, even if they're harsh, they're always easier to comply with than rules that are very complicated. And so if you just tell the private sector, look, China's a national security risk. From here on out, you can buy stuff from China, but it's going to be way more expensive. You guys figure out where it makes sense for you to make your goods. It could be India, it could be Vietnam, it could be a combination of, a bunch of different countries, but it can be Chinese companies and it can be from China. They will be really good, I think, at figuring out what makes sense for their business.
Well, Biden's already doing it. This week, he announced, tariffs on $18 billion worth of Chinese hardware imports, including semiconductors. Can you talk to the broader applications of the threats that these kinds of technologies pose and why they're targets specifically?
Yeah, so I will note Biden's tariffs are a welcome step in the right direction. They're obviously substantially below the 100% tariffs that President Trump has proposed. So, hey, directionally, I'm really happy that we're talking about tariffs and that it seems to have bipartisan support. While they're incredibly strategic, we use them in everything. And one of the really amazing revelations or learnings, should I say, from the work that OpenAI has been doing in the AI space is that we've actually seen that, OpenAI's basic experiment is if you throw more compute at the learning process, you actually get you actually get a much larger model that is substantially more advanced. And there is a correlation between compute and the sophistication of a model. And so, if that basic thesis is true, then you want to have a lot of chips because you want to have a lot of compute power, basically. And so, it's no wonder why Chinese companies like ByteDance have placed over $100 billion in orders of chips from NVIDIA, for example, because it's a gold rush. They want to have massive amounts of compute capacity in order to train very large models.
There's been a real cultural shift between Silicon Valley and Capitol Hill, it seems. This is one example of it with the bipartisan support that you got on the TikTok divestiture bill. But if we look back and at the not too distant or not so far away history, there was one stage where Google employees were protesting against its deals with the Pentagon through the Maven project. And you said in your speech at the Hill and Valley Forum just a few days ago, quote, "The era of Silicon Valley's neutrality is over." What do you think has driven that and why now?
Yeah, I think so. I will say in the mid 2010s, there was a gulf and a rift between Silicon Valley and Capitol Hill, and very little interaction, actually. The main exposure that Silicon Valley had in Washington were executives at very large technology firms like Google and, at the time, Facebook. And Washington had almost no exposure to the ecosystem of startups that were working on solving hard problems. Part of what I think has happened is that people in Silicon Valley have become much more attuned to the national security concerns that folks in Washington have. Part of that has been, I think there's been a lot more discussion in Silicon Valley. I think my book helped, which I published in 2021. I also think the war in Ukraine and world events have really precipitated a higher degree of interest and has caused a lot of people in Silicon Valley to, lean into geopolitical news and events. And, as a result, we've seen with the Silicon Valley Forum, attendance basically double every year. So the first one was 100 people. The second one was 200 people. The third one, during the daytime, we had 400 people, which is really amazing. We actually had 1,000 RSVPs. Our venue could only support 400.
Wow, that's amazing. Congratulations.
It really is amazing. And I think it really speaks for the level of interest that people in Silicon Valley have in wanting to engage Washington. And I will say, we've also doubled the number of elected officials each year, basically. And I think that also speaks for the level of interest in Washington to engage folks in Silicon Valley.
Well, where do you see this relationship going next? If you take sort of what you were saying there with the military threat, for lack of a better term, with the AI sort of tech arms race, do you need a Manhattan Project for AI to ensure that the US stays ahead of the game here?
So I have been a very big proponent of a two-pronged AI policy agenda. On the one hand, we need to make sure that we win the AI race and that we have the very best capabilities in AI in the world. I think it's so important because I think the narrower the gap gets in our technological capabilities and China's, the less deterred China might be, and the higher the risk of political instability and potentially armed conflict. So I think if we want peace, we really need to stay ahead. Number two, I think in order to stay ahead, we have to put in place safeguards and guardrails, and we need to figure out what the right way to do this is. But we need to stop China from getting access to our most sensitive stuff. And that might mean cracking down on the cottage industry of spies that the Chinese have in Silicon Valley, of which they have many, and being a lot less naive about these things. But I think we really need, China steals $500 billion worth of IP from US companies every year. That's a big problem. And so we need to do more to stem that bleeding.
I'm so glad you brought up spies, or rather, as Vinod calls them, implants, because I was going to ask you for your thoughts on that in my next question, but I'll scrap that one since you brought it up already. My last question here is a slightly more selfish one, really, coming from a small country like New Zealand. So, the first part of this question, do you think that other countries will follow in America's lead here? And how do you think that looks? Will it be outright bans or tariffs? And B, that really hurts small countries like New Zealand because we need to be neutral to survive. So how does that play out for us?
Well, I'm not sure. I would maybe quibble a little bit with the idea that New Zealand necessarily has to be neutral, just because New Zealand's also an amazing democracy, and I would hope New Zealand would thrive more in a world that is free compared to a world that is unfree. With that being said, I mean, I think it's interesting that the French government, Gabriel Attal, the young prime minister in France, has actually instituted a ban on TikTok in New Caledonia, which is a French territory, as a result of evidently a groundswell of protests, which the French government believes has been fomented through, China's beloved TikTok app. And so it's interesting that one of the responses from the French government was to in place a TikTok ban. So I really do think that there might be a bit of a contagion effect where other governments start to take a close look on how these Chinese-owned social media apps are impacting their countries. And I think that's a great welcome development.
So bottom line, should New Zealand look to ban TikTok? So far, we've only banned it on parliamentary phones, but haven't gone any further.
I haven't followed the influence of TikTok in New Zealand closely, but I do know from the work that ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, has done in Australia, which obviously is, a close neighbor to New Zealand, that China is very active in the region in election interference, and it has used TikTok as one of its variety of different tools to engage in election interference. And so I think it would make sense for any democracy that wants to preserve the vibrancy of its and the integrity of its public discourse domestically to look at restricting and requiring the divestiture of this company.
Thank you so much for your time, Jacob. It's been amazing to chat to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I have really enjoyed it.
Thanks for watching Markets with Madison, the New Zealand Herald show for interested investors. If you want to stay up to date with financial markets, click the subscribe button below, and you can watch our other episodes here. Stay up to date with all the business news and numbers as they land on nzherald.co.nz.